Collection of information on the Plejaren from the Contact Reports Part 2. Then Shemia.
Contact Report 711.
Although I know the effective background, in which also the then sphere is integrated, which orbited around all inhabited planets in your Plejaren system more than 52,000 years ago for 32 days each, after which all human beings became peaceful. I think that you could explain everything about this from your side once, in order to also create clarity in this regard.
That was indeed how my father was, because he only ever explained as much as was necessary. But we shouldn't talk about that now, but about what concerns us, Plejaren. I must begin by addressing what occurred on Era and our other Plejaren planets some 52,000 years ago. At that time, swinging waves were emitted from the flying sphere, which circled around Era and also around the other Plejaren planets for 32 days each, which took control of a certain brain region and a precisely defined area in all planet inhabitants, against which there was no possibility of defense, as could be fathomed by our scientists at that time. Our directives do not allow me to explain what the processes were and which areas of the brain and exact regions of the brain were involved, because more precise information for the Earth humans or their brain researchers could lead to findings which they would then, as is usual with Earth scientists when they gain new findings, convert into new useful weapons for wars and secret services, and then misuse them for murder, destruction, torture, and for warlike purposes. On the one hand, this would come about via the neuroscientists, who would use everything in such a wise as to manipulate the structure and functioning of the nervous systems of Earth humans in such a manner that they would be destroyed and rendered non-functional. Whole peoples would be exterminated or simply made to suffer and become ill, for example, through the widespread dissemination and radiation of swinging waves causing illness among the Earth humans concerned, who are to be exterminated or harassed. Polyneuropathy and migraine, as well as neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease, autoimmunological diseases such as multiple sclerosis could also be caused, as well as craniocerebral trauma, strokes, cerebral hemorrhages, epilepsy, brain tumors, and meningitis, etc., against all of which there would no longer be any treatment possibilities and therapy alternatives. Further, diseases of consciousness such as insanity, idiocy, and feeble-mindedness, etc., would also be considered in this respect, as well as incurable depression and psychic disorders, etc.
That would be more than inhumane. But it would be appropriate to explain what happened to you Plejaren more than 52,000 years ago, respectively how and by what means your peoples of all Plejaren planets achieved peace and freedom.
But this could indeed os arten, to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, in the manner you said, which is why I must not consider any further details and explanations and explain anything in more detail. However, I may explain, which I will do only briefly and without elaboration, what happened to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, but I really do not intend to go into detail. It turned out that the swinging wave impulses emitted by the aforementioned spherical flying machine very effectively influenced certain areas of the brain of all the planet's inhabitants, and had such an effect on special areas that all impulses of violence and degeneracy were appeased, but not extinguished, only put into a softened state and made peaceful. This was sufficient for the populations of all the planets to fall away from all malignant violence and become in a peaceful mood within the time during which the spherical flying machine circled the worlds, but nevertheless they retained their free will and, above all, without external verbal influences from the state leaders and their unpeaceful propaganda, etc., they became more and more inclined to rationality and intellect, and began to think, consider, decide, and act independently. the calming, swinging wave influences, which acted only on certain areas of the brain and, in these, only on special areas, were neither aggressive nor compelling, for there were only vibratory impulses through which understanding and reason were stimulated and led to the populations discarding their collective world of thought within a few days, because they became free from all the unpeaceful suggestive collective thinking controlled by the governments and religions, and were able to form their own independent thoughts and opinions. By very quickly discarding their collective thinking, controlled by governments and religions, and also very quickly learning and using their own individual thoughts, the human beings of the Plejaren planets learned and grasped their personal self-knowledge and formed their own and ever-increasing self-determination, through which they attained personal mental strength. In a special way, the dropping and abandonment of all religious belief factors, and thus the perception and realization of the natural creational laws, which are universally oriented towards peacefulness, freedom, and self-reliance, had an effect. When this was recognized by all Plejaren populations of all our worlds, and every religious belief was discarded and frowned upon, manifold realizations were formed, and from them the result of personal attitudes and far-reaching thought processes and certainties, which led to all human beings of all peoples setting themselves independently challenging goals and sticking to them even under difficulties, learning to cope with failures better and well, working out a higher motivation and achieving their set self-realization goals. It was also found that within only 11 days, they were less and less distracted by the opinions of other persons, and above all, also no longer allowed themselves to be distracted by the suggestive, unpeaceful whispers of the government, nor allowed themselves to fall back into unpeacefulness. On the contrary, all the populations of all the planets henceforth made all the necessary efforts and perseverance to achieve their goals. Very quickly they became aware of their own abilities and just as quickly learned to control and master situations of all kinds that arose and quickly became mentally strong. Persons who also learned to make use of their abilities by constantly seeking and finding new challenges for their intellect and reason, as well as for their self-development and self-realization, and by realizing them as well as themselves. Thus, within a very short time, the individual human beings learn to cope with stress and strain and to live in control of all their self-created personality traits. Through their steadily growing mental strength, they very quickly created a consciousness-like capacity that also had a strong effect on their mental and physical health, as well as on the fact that they were always setting themselves new, challenging goals and realizing them. And all this, together with many other positive developments, finally led within only 32 days, during which the orbital aircraft circled the worlds, to all persons of all. Populations finally freeing themselves independently and according to their own free will from all Ausartungen, getting very badly out of control of their good human natures, and from all violence and immorality, etc., through the unimaginably strong swinging wave impulses of evolutionary effect, which were emitted by the flying sphere and influenced the personalities of all our Plejaren planets. All human beings became aware within a very short time that they were being influenced externally by other persons, forces and populist and unpeaceful government-controlled influences which were hostile to peace, degenerate, inciting violence and destructive, as well as impairing the intellect and reason, negative and malignant, and were influencing them negatively against their own will and causing them to lapse into violence, etc. This realization led the human beings of all our planets to renounce violence, immorality, degeneracy, evil, and wickedness, and also to conquer their bad habits. It was also recognized, however, that in spite of all knowledge and efforts with regard to the conduct of life in the good, the correct, the human, and with regard to righteousness, as well as with regard to the observance of the natural positive creative laws. The human being always remains susceptible and can fall back again into old ungood, negative, evil, and bad behavior if he does not make the necessary effort to control it in order to prevent it. And it has been recognized that this can always happen again if the human beings are influenced from the outside in any verbal, physical or consciousness, thought, emotion, and psyche burdening forms for long enough. So in this respect, all human beings of all Plejaren planets or their populations were subordinated to this natural creative law of action in such a way that countermeasures had to be taken, which were recorded and followed in directives, and which consisted in the fact that no direct or otherwise harmful connections were to be sought and maintained with alien worlds and their populations, in order not to relapse into the old modes of behavior through such contacts with alien peoples who were not like our ancestors. We Plejaren of today are also human beings, like our ancestors 52,000 years ago and all our descendants since then, who must resist such external influences without being harmed, for unfortunately we are still susceptible to negative external influences that would cause us to relapse into the old ways of behavior if we were to fall long enough into areas of negative influence that were harmful to us and were hit by factors that had a negative effect on us. We Plejaren, too, are human beings and are ordered to develop within the framework of every natural creational order and lawfulness through a very laborious working out of our higher evolution of consciousness, which even after 52,000 years of peace, we must follow and continue to learn. And this we can do today through the life teaching of Nocademion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which helps us unspeakably much in our further evolution of consciousness, but which was known to us only in small parts up to the beginning of your mission, but which you now bring and teach not only to Earth humans, but also to us, in many expanded versions. But as far as our ancestors were concerned, more than 52,000 years ago, they only gained their knowledge at that time, and only then became aware of the effective facts and values of life according to the natural creative laws. When the flying sphere appeared and circled around our Plejaren planets, whereby all Plejaren populations were struck by its vibratory impulses and were appeased and peacefully tuned in a restrained, yet definite and effective manner. Through these vibratory impulses, their minds and reason were stimulated, whereby the populations turned to the gently urging peaceful impulses and gave themselves consciously learning to their evolution of consciousness. Through this attention, our ancestors of that time recognized the truth and effectiveness of the natural creative laws and correct natural creative conditioned way of life, learned to fathom them and to follow them, and made them their own, whereby henceforth all populations consciously developed according to them and aligned themselves to them in every way. But they were able to do all this only after they realized that their entire very high technical development in all its forms and possibilities did not turn them away from their degenerations, their violent behavior, and from all evil, from all warfare and all destructive and negative and evil behavior with regard to peace, real freedom, righteousness, justice, and humanity, as well as a way of life according to natural creative laws. Only through the influence of the vibrational impulses, which were emitted by the spherical flying device and by which they were peacefully influenced, did they find their way to personal change and finally, through their own development of consciousness, cognition and their efforts, their own will, their intellect, their reason, and the use of their intelligence, they attained their personal inner peace, their personal inner freedom and righteousness. And this inestimable gain and victory over themselves they also began to bring to bear externally, whereby all peoples also allied themselves among themselves in a continuing state of peace and freedom, and since then all violence, degenerations, and wars, etc., have also become a thing of the past. However, it must be repeated as a fact that all violence, wars, all hatred and falsehood, all discord, all unfreedom and unrighteousness, as well as all injustice and degeneracy, etc., in all forms, could only be ended. In all forms could only be brought to an end when the vibratory impulses of the orb had an effect upon all the Plejaren peoples and soothed them into peace, whereby they became consciously powerful of their own independent and externally uninfluenced faculty of thought, as well as of their intellect, their reason, and the application of their intelligentsia, and thereby their own self-evolution could take place. This did not mean, however, that our ancestors 52,000 years ago, or since, were above any susceptibility to and reversion to the old, degenerate, malignant, warlike, violent, and all other negative forms and disregarding all natural creative laws. And this is not the case even in modern times, for even we Plejaren of today are not immune to this, just as all our ancestors were not. This is well known to us Plejaren, and we also know through the teaching of Nocademion that in order to be above all susceptibility and backsliding into the old negative patterns of degenerations, violence, wars, hatred, falsehood, and wickedness, etc., it takes much more than just the change to peace, freedom, justice, and righteousness, etc., in the human being, and that all this cannot simply be worked out through the normal development of understanding, reason, intelligence, and knowledge. But this very much more is only possible for a human being, no matter who, how, what, and from where he is, whether from Earth, from our Plejaren planets, or elsewhere, when very thoroughly and intensively throughout all times it is learned to perceive reality and the truth contained therein, and to implement all the resulting knowledge for self and self-development in a correct, positive, and evolutionary way. And the comprehensive realization, which gradually matured in all the human beings of our Plejaren populations, also led to the realization of the fact that all becoming of all natural creative flourishing requires long periods of time, which in this respect led all Plejaren peoples to the realization and understanding that they would never stop learning, but would have to learn all their lives and keep on learning, because learning would never come to an end, but would continue endlessly and also in every new life in relation to every new personality. So it became clear and understandable that learning must never end, and therefore must always continue in each new life of each new personality for many millennia, decades, thousands, centuries, thousands, and millions of years, until the eventual entrance into the higher planes of the High Council and higher. But this also meant, and this was recognized in the course of time, that throughout all the times that the human being incarnates again and again as a new personality and exists and lives as a material life form, he must endlessly learn and keep on learning, which is why he, as a learning human being, will also never be immune from making mistakes again and again in order to learn from them and to continue everything better and learning positively. However, this was also connected with the realization that as a result of the lifelong learning process of each new personality, there was also the danger and possibility connected with and timeless throughout all new incarnations and new personalities of falling back into the old behavior patterns of earlier personalities, despite each higher development achieved. But it was recognized that especially suggestive verbal, thought, and emotion-related influences, as well as consciousness and psychic disturbances, and manifold deed-related external influences from fellow human beings can bring about and cause very negative relapses with regard to behavior of every kind. And this realization that such outside influences from fellow human beings have a suggestive effect and provoke and evoke relapses into old negative behavior patterns and ultimately allow them to be broken through, led to directives being drawn up which warned against and forbade this, that henceforth no more off-planet contacts and connections were to be cultivated with peoples or individual life forms whose life and behavioral evolutionary level as well as their consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, action, and reason rationality was lower than the general average of the Plejaren population in this respect. And these directives have been preserved throughout the ages up to the present day, and thus continue to be valid even into the most distant future. This is because we have known for 52,000 years through the teachings of Nocademion, which you impart to our humanity, as well as to Earth humans, that through various external, suggestive or any other negative influences, the susceptibility to relapse into old negative patterns and norms is always given in all human beings in universal breadth. Consequently, we Plejaren are also disadvantaged by such energies and forces acting upon us, and could relapse into old behavior patterns. But we have to protect ourselves against this, whereby we behave in this respect, according to our directives, fulfill them unswervingly in observance and compliance, and therefore run no risk of suffering any harm. Through the teaching of Nocademion, which you impart to us, we now also know that the human being is so long prone to setbacks and relapses into old negative forms of old behavior, until he no longer needs his material body, which will only be when his spirit form enters the higher plane of the High Council. Only then will the consciousness of the human being have reached a higher stage of evolution and can also profit from it and usefully perceive, apply, and effectively implement the ever-positive impulses from the spirit form in consciousness. But if this is not the case, then the possibility of danger always remains with regard to susceptibility and backsliding into old negative mental and behavioral patterns, etc., which is why it must always be fought against, and everything must be consciously controlled, so that a relapse into the old degenerated patterns is avoided. And this danger of relapse always exists in any case, and with every human being, if he is suggestively influenced from outside in his consciousness, his intellect, his reason, and his intelligence, etc., and if his spirit form has also not yet evolved to a sufficiently high degree. But this is also the case with us Plejaren in this way, because our consciousness and intellect, our reason and our intelligentsia, due to the lack of a sufficiently high evolution of consciousness, are still susceptible to degenerated external influences of every possible kind, whereby in particular linguistic and deed-related influences from outside and behavioral patterns of human beings directly affecting us are such that they could have a negative effect on us and throw us back into the old degenerations and effects, which were still peculiar to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, and from which we must also protect ourselves in the present time, and still very far into the future. In this respect, respectively, also our very highly developed technology of every kind cannot protect us, since we can only use it for ourselves in many other ways. Whereas we are dependent on our intellect, our reason, our intelligence, and our directives in every respect with regard to our evolution, mentality, and all our behavior, in order to preserve and not to endanger the high values of life of every kind and manner, which we have continuously acquired through our ancestors and ourselves. And this corresponds to something that may seem incomprehensible to the majority of Earth humans, as well as to the fact that, For these reasons, we cannot and must not get involved in any direct or other contacts and connections with other thinking and other living life forms or human beings such as Earth humans. This fact is therefore one of the most important reasons why we Plejaren hold back and, in accordance with our security and our directives created in this respect, are not allowed to enter into any direct or telepathic contact or any form of technical communication with persons and peoples of other worlds. This is precisely when they are not like our Plejaren values in their forms of mentality and behavior, as well as in their way of life and in their use of intellect, reason and intelligence, etc., but are degenerate and violent to the contrary, as well as criminally deficient in respect of righteousness and the observance of the natural creative laws, as is very distinctly the case with Earth humans, among whom only very few exceptions are to be found, who, if not extensively, yet at least in part, endeavor to learn a better, positive, and natural creative correct way of life. The negative factors mentioned, as they are drastically present in Earth humans, also occur in the third grouping as well as in the Earth future beings, who on the one hand have already been on Earth for thousands of years or otherwise for a considerable time, again and again demonstrating their presence in various ways. These explanations should suffice, for I have thus clarified the most important facts.
Contact Report 712.
What you explain, I have understood and defined from everything that the whole thing is not only an Earth human being problem, but this also concerns you, Plejaren. I understand from your detailed explanation that you have addressed exactly that which prevents you from coming into contact with the Earthlings or other like-minded human beings. This is precisely because you too are burdened by the factor of the mentality scheme part, which can be attacked, influenced and changed by outside influences. Consequently, you Plejaren also run the risk of falling back into the old waters, which still prevailed with you more than 52,000 years ago, if you cannot comprehensively control, shield and protect yourselves against the Earth humans' Osca Ardita to get very badly out of control of the good human nature mentality and its malicious, negative thought-feeling world as well as its radiating effects and behavior patterns.
Your statement is absolutely correct because, in fact, it is as you say. It is explanatory to say that, in other words, it results that once a mental direction has been taken and firmly fixed, a construct of thought, a direction of learning, behavior, and everything in general that the human thinks of as good, positive, correct, as a creation-aligned lifestyle, humanity, righteousness, love, peace, freedom and justice, etc. has been worked out, effected, created, trained, brought about, and achieved as a culmination point and behavior to the state of life behavior, very quickly becomes completely void again if conscious control and prevention fails. This is seen solely in terms of the external influences on the mentality schema part, which as a collective factor is influenceable and changeable. And the whole of this corresponds to the same factor as is inherent in us Plejaren. Consequently, we too, like Earth humans, are susceptible to outside influences. Consequently, we must, as I have already explained to you in another conversation, protect ourselves from the very negative and destructive mental influences of Earth humans and must not cultivate any contacts with them.
Contact Report 715.
If such a thing were to happen, as you have mentioned, then my opinion and my actions would be such as you have expressed your opinion. However, I must explain to the whole that in all our peoples on all four worlds we have had no crime and no violent crime for over 52,000 years. This is because all our peoples are peaceful and, also with regard to all their behavior, only orientate themselves towards living in peaceful coexistence with everything and everyone that exists. So with regard to all peoples and humanities, human-like, human-similar, and other higher life forms, in which, however, the whole of nature and its fauna and flora are also included. As you asked me, I also heard from your tone the question of what we Plejaren in general would do in the situation you mentioned if Plejaren were to commit unlawful acts in foreign countries. To this I must say that even though we have had no crime and no violent crimes for 52,000 years, we nevertheless have a wide-ranging legislation to regulate all conceivable affairs, occurrences, events, occurrences, objects, occurrences, possibilities, occurrences, things, parts, matters, subjects, and occurrences, etc., that come into existence. This also includes a legal regulation, which refers to the fact that if such an improbability were to arise, a person commits an unlawful act or deed in a foreign place, this person would have to be brought to account there in the territory of the act or deed carried out. Thus, in that sector, the population there would have to be summoned to account for the punishability of the unlawful act or deed, and would have to issue an appropriate assessment of the measure to be taken, which, however, would in any case have to be in a humane, but nonetheless in a sustainable, punishable framework, in which the person in question, who had committed an offense, would have to fit in. Jurisdiction and punishment in the sense that they are commonplace among Earth humans have not existed here for more than 52,000 years. I therefore believe that we Plejaren have all conceivable, possible, and necessary legislation, and also that which is necessary for all possible emergencies, by which all things and also penal provisions, etc., are regulated. However, because we know neither crime nor violent crime or any degenerations in the coexistence of our humanity, we do not have any jurisdictions, as a result of which the populations of a place would be called to account and demand accountability if, improbably, any unlawful actions, deeds, and incidents, etc., were to occur.
Contact Report 721.
You can hold that as you like, because the only thing that is important, I think, is that you write your teaching on this for Earth humans as well.
I will do that, as I have said, for the very nonsense that our earthling philosophers have been spreading since time immemorial, and also still do nowadays, should really be made clear.
It really should be, because what you have written in this regard, teaching us, corresponds exactly to what I have been able to find in the meantime in our very old OM canon records, which exist in written form and date back to an age of more than 2.7 million years. However, I was only able to find these records in the sphere through your precise instructions, which you gave me from the Nocademion memory bank, because it was not, nor is it, possible for me to get into it. And if it had been possible for me, I would not have known where to look in the 77 million canons.
I knew that, you will find the ancient OM records in the big metal sphere structure, which is effectively a big ancient library. And these OM records must be complete down to the last canon, as I've been orienting myself from the memory bank. But do you think it is correct for us to talk about this now in our official conversation?
In my opinion, this is not only correct, but also necessary and important, because with this I can finally also express my opinion on what I think with regard to your denunciation, namely that you should actually be responsible as a herald for our and you honoring Plejaren peoples, but not for Earth humans who disgracefully disregard you, insult you, threaten you, and have degenerated into evil-mindedness and religious delusion in their majority. And there.
Excuse me for interrupting you, because I think it is necessary. Well, I think I can understand you and what you are saying, but we must certainly bear in mind that everything must have its correctness. Otherwise, the whole thing would not have been arranged by the level Arahat Atharsata in the way it has come about and is now. As you know, dear friend, Early ancestors of you Plejaren emigrated to this earth, and many of them also died here on this planet, as a result of which their forms of creation, or their spirit forms, have since reincarnated again and again on Earth in new personalities. And this is still the case today and tomorrow, as well as the day after tomorrow and in the far future, because for the earlier emigrants from the Ankar universe or space-time structure, precisely for the Plejaren emigrants at that time, it was determined that their distant and most distant descendants should be taught until far into the future, with regard to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of the life. This is also how it was recorded in the memory bank of Nocademion. As I explained to you, your daughters Simya Se and also Quetzal and Asket, when you all asked me about what was basically the origin and purpose of our contacts, about which you all did not have any complete information. From my personal point of view, however, I find that not only the earthbound descendant personalities of the ancient Plejaren need the teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, but also all earthlings. This is especially so, for when I see how bad and terrible and evil-minded the majority of earthlings are, how they are dominated by an immense amount of misery, hatred, vindictiveness, discord, unfreedom, disharmony and war, by murder, manslaughter and terror, as well as by criminality, crime, lack of honor and dignity, by dishonesty, vices, greed, unkindness, malice and falsehood, etc., then I cannot help but feel that they are in need of the teaching of truth. Then I cannot help but also strive for this humanity by also striving for it to bring and spread the teaching. For this I have no reward, which I do not want anyway, but I am left with the hope that one or two human beings on Earth will nevertheless take up an iota of the teaching, think about it and find the way to then also really learn and follow the teaching in order to make a true human being out of themselves. Now, because I have access to the memory bank of Nocademion as a result of my Nocademion lineage, in which all information is contained without exception, which also applies to all successor personalities, determined by the energy form of creation up to the present day and into the future. It was and is always possible for me to search for and find everything necessary in the memory bank of Nocademion. Through this, during one of my last visits to you on Era, I was also able to make an effort with regard to the metal sphere image and find out that it is a large and ancient library, which also contains the entire OM canon work. But since you were forbidden to open this spherical library by force, which you could not have done, even by force, I searched for the sign in the memory bank and was then able to tell you how you could open the structure.
It was a very clear instruction handed down to us from time immemorial that we had to keep to it. Never to open the great spherical structure, because there was an evil threat associated with it, involving a planet-wide catastrophe if force was used to try to open it. The directive contained a clear and precise instruction that the spherical structure was not to be opened until the correct time, when the Herald of Horseshoe Mountain would come and give the sign to open. What we will find in the now opened and for us still immeasurably diverse library, we do not yet know and can also not yet guess, because we opened the image only a few days ago with your sign. But what we have found in this great spherical monument, which has always been hermetically sealed, and what records, etc., will be there, we cannot yet estimate. Only after we had opened this structure, which had not been permitted since time immemorial, but only through you, because you, as a personality of the direct Nocademian lineage, were and are entitled to do so, did we become aware of the immeasurable responsibility to which we now have to submit, and which we now also have to consciously bear and strive to fulfill and carry into all the future to come. My father Svath must have known a lot about this, which he also listed in his annals and left them for us to study and take on the mission traditionally cultivated in our family line. And our family line includes all of us who are his direct descendants, as well as our descendants and those who are related to us, in relation to this mission which we and all our descendants will carry on into the future. But what will now come to us in its full extent, when we work our way through all the records and documents in the new and diverse library, we will probably only be able to recognize and grasp after many years. And I think that although my father Svath knew a great deal about the whole task, he did not know the full extent of it, for as he has stated in his annals, it was only through you that he came to much of the information you made available to him from the Nocademion memory bank. Now it is so that my family and all of us who are involved in the mission, through the opening of the immeasurably rich library, can only now gain access to manifold knowledge and to all OM canons, and thus also to our real task in relation to the mission, and can intensively concern ourselves with it. Already we have all come together and have had our first important conversations, as we have also decided in unanimous assurances to fulfill our task in faithfulness, knowledge, and duty. Unfortunately, everything has only come about in this way at the present time, because you have always held back and never said a word about what is hidden in the old large metal sphere structure and in the OM records it contains, as well as in the entire library mass. You must have known about it, yet you never spoke about it, but why not?
That is actually simple. Because I was not allowed to say anything about it, because that is how it is ordered in the memory bank of Nocademion. That is why your father Svath was also not allowed to say anything to you when I had to explain some things to him regarding the large metal sphere formation according to a certain rule from the memory bank. And furthermore, I can and must say now, since so much has already been made clear, that I had to act in this way, also by telling you the secret of opening the image, the sign as you call it. And this was necessary, for you Plejaren are to be the heirs of the entire teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, as Nocademion wisely determined for you in his time. Therefore, it was and is time for you Plejaren to take up your inheritance and make use of it, and put it into reality. Besides, I must also explain, time does not stand still, which is also expressed through aging, also in my case. With this, I mean to say that my work is also coming to an end for this time, and the course of my life is gradually drawing to a close, which has prompted me to hand over the legacy of Nocademion to you Plejaren, while it is still possible for me to do so. And with that, dear friend, all that needs to be said is said.
Contact Report 721.
You can hold that as you like, because the only thing that is important, I think, is that you write your teaching on this for Earth humans as well.
I will do that, as I have said, for the very nonsense that our earthling philosophers have been spreading since time immemorial, and also still do nowadays, should really be made clear.
It really should be, because what you have written in this regard, teaching us, corresponds exactly to what I have been able to find in the meantime in our very old OM canon records, which exist in written form and date back to an age of more than 2.7 million years. However, I was only able to find these records in the sphere through your precise instructions which you gave me from the Nocademion memory bank because it was not, nor is it, possible for me to get into it. And if it had been possible for me, I would not have known where to look in the 77 million canons.
I knew that. You will find the ancient OM records in the big metal sphere structure, which is effectively a big ancient library. And these OM records must be complete down to the last canon, as I've been orienting myself from the memory bank. But do you think it is correct for us to talk about this now in our official conversation?
In my opinion, this is not only correct, but also necessary and important, because with this, I can finally also express my opinion on what I think with regard to your denunciation, namely that you should actually be responsible as a herald for our and you honoring Plejaren peoples, but not for Earth humans, who disgracefully disregard you, insult you, threaten you, and have degenerated into evil-mindedness and religious delusion in their majority. And there,
Excuse me for interrupting you, because I think it is necessary. Well, I think I can understand you and what you are saying, but we must certainly bear in mind that everything must have its correctness. Otherwise, the whole thing would not have been arranged by the level Arahat Atharsata in the way it has come about and is now. As you know, dear friend, early ancestors of you Plejaren emigrated to this earth, and many of them also died here on this planet, as a result of which their forms of creation, or their spirit forms, have since reincarnated again and again on Earth in new personalities. And this is still the case today and tomorrow, as well as the day after tomorrow and in the far future. Because for the earlier emigrants from the Ankar universe or space-time structure, precisely for the Plejaren emigrants at that time, it was determined that their distant and most distant descendants should be taught until far into the future with regard to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of the life. This is also how it was recorded in the memory bank of Nocademion. As I explained to you, your daughter Simya, Say, and also Quetzal and Asket, when you all asked me about what was basically the origin and purpose of our contacts, about which you all did not have any complete information. From my personal point of view, however, I find that not only the earthbound descendant personalities of the ancient Plejaren need the teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, but also all earthlings. This is especially so, for when I see how bad and terrible and evil-minded the majority of earthlings are, how they are dominated by an immense amount of misery, hatred, vindictiveness, discord, unfreedom, disharmony and war, by murder, manslaughter and terror, as well as by criminality, crime, lack of honor and dignity, by dishonesty, vices, greed, unkindness, malice and falsehood, etc., then I cannot help but feel that they are in need of the teaching of truth. Then I cannot help but also strive for this humanity, by also striving for it to bring and spread the teaching. For this I have no reward, which I do not want anyway. But I am left with the hope that one or two human beings on Earth will nevertheless take up an iota of the teaching, think about it, and find the way to then also really learn and follow the teaching in order to make a true human being out of themselves. Now, because I have access to the memory bank of Nocademion as a result of my Nocademion lineage, in which all information is contained without exception, which also applies to all successor personalities, determined by the energy form of creation up to the present day and into the future, it was and is always possible for me to search for and find everything necessary in the memory bank of Nocademion. Through this, during one of my last visits to you on Era, I was also able to make an effort with regard to the metal sphere image and find out that it is a large and ancient library, which also contains the entire OM canon work. But since you were forbidden to open this spherical library by force, which you could not have done, even by force, I searched for the sign in the memory bank and was then able to tell you how you could open the structure.
it was a very clear instruction handed down to us from time immemorial that we had to keep to it. Never to open the great spherical structure because there was an evil threat associated with it, involving a planet-wide catastrophe if force was used to try to open it. The directive contained a clear and precise instruction that the spherical structure was not to be opened until the correct time, when the Herald of Horseshoe Mountain would come and give the sign to open. What we will find in the now opened and for us still immeasurably diverse library, we do not yet know and can also not yet guess, because we opened the image only a few days ago with your sign. But what we have found in this great spherical monument, which has always been hermetically sealed, and what records etc. will be there, we cannot yet estimate. Only after we had opened this structure, which had not been permitted since time immemorial, but only through you, because you, as a personality of the direct Nocademion lineage, were and are entitled to do so, did we become aware of the immeasurable responsibility to which we now have to submit and which we now also have to consciously bear and strive to fulfill and carry into all the future to come. My father Svath must have known a lot about this, which he also listed in his annals and left them for us to study and take on the mission traditionally cultivated in our family line. And our family line includes all of us who are his direct descendants, as well as our descendants and those who are related to us in relation to this mission which we and all our descendants will carry on into the future. But what will now come to us in its full extent? When we work our way through all the records and documents in the new and diverse library, we will probably only be able to recognize and grasp after many years. And I think that although my father Svath knew a great deal about the whole task, he did not know the full extent of it, for as he has stated in his annals, it was only through you that he came to much of the information you made available to him from the Nocademion memory bank. Now it is so that my family and all of us who are involved in the mission, through the opening of the immeasurably rich library, can only now gain access to manifold knowledge and to all OM canons, and thus also to our real task in relation to the mission, and can intensively concern ourselves with it. Already we have all come together and have had our first important conversations, as we have also decided in unanimous assurances to fulfill our task in faithfulness, knowledge, and duty. Unfortunately, everything has only come about in this way at the present time, because you have always held back and never said a word about what is hidden in the old large metal sphere structure and in the OM records it contains, as well as in the entire library mass. You must have known about it, yet you never spoke about it, but why not?
That is actually simple. Ptah! Because I was not allowed to say anything about it, because that is how it is ordered in the memory bank of Nocademion. That is why your father Svath was also not allowed to say anything to you when I had to explain some things to him regarding the large metal sphere formation, according to a certain rule from the memory bank. And furthermore, I can and must say now, since so much has already been made clear, that I had to act in this way, also by telling you the secret of opening the image, the sign, as you call it. And this was necessary. For you, Plejaren, are to be the heirs of the entire teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, as Nocademion wisely determined for you in his time. Therefore, it was and is time for you, Plejaren, to take up your inheritance and make use of it and put it into reality. Besides, I must also explain, time does not stand still, which is also expressed through aging, also in my case. With this, I mean to say that my work is also coming to an end for this time, and the course of my life is gradually drawing to a close, which has prompted me to hand over the legacy of Nocademion to you, Plejaren, while it is still possible for me to do so. And with that, dear friend, all that needs to be said is said.
Contact Report 718.
No, we Plejaren never had anything to do with it. Because without exception, these flying apparatuses observed everywhere, called UFOs by Earth humans, did not belong to us, but to the aliens who have been working on Earth since time immemorial. If we could be observed and photographed, then we deliberately allowed this to happen only to members of your groups or to persons who were friends of yours, while we specially commissioned you to take pictures and films of our flying apparatus. In doing so, we were also always careful that the strangers could not gain any knowledge of this and make absolutely no observations, because we did not want to give any encouragement for them, as we do not now and will not in the future, to record our presence, because we do not want to endanger our homeland, and therefore we are not allowed to make any contact with the strangers. Establishing contact with any strangers always means insecurity and danger, even if a good relationship is established under certain circumstances, because all life forms are susceptible to overt or subterranean indoctrination, as a result of which a great deal of harm can come about. Under certain circumstances, connections can also result from contacts that can lead to attacks, conquests, and wars, which is why our directives forbid us to make contact with the aliens working here on Earth, or even to make ourselves recognizable to them. If we were to make ourselves recognizable to them in any way, then on the one hand we would violate our directives. On the other hand, we would run the risk of betraying our space-time structure, and thus also our homeland, and, in addition, under certain circumstances, we would relapse into the old behavioral patterns of our early ancestors due to the influences of the strangers. We Plejaren are also human beings and still burdened in our deepest character with unpleasant impulses, even though we have been making great efforts for more than 52,000 years to work them out and to dissolve them. But this takes a very, very long time and always means that there is a danger that through indoctrinating influences of other mentalities, in one case or another, relapses into the old patterns of behavior could occur. This is fundamentally the fact of our strict restraint in every respect towards foreigners. What you asked about the flying objects of all kinds and sizes of the aliens, which have been observed by Earth humans again and again for centuries, even in the present time, and also by you in the center and by members of the association everywhere, that therefore never had and never has anything to do with us Plejaren, because we have no connection whatsoever with the aliens. It is true that they have a very high level of technology, but it cannot be compared with ours and is still very much in need of development. This does not mean, however, that their mentality is also at a higher level of development, which, according to our long-term research, is not the case either. In the end, it must be said once again that all observations of unknown flying objects, etc., since all times, as is also the case at the present new time, can only be traced back to the strangers with whom we have no contact whatsoever, and who are also unable to perceive our existence and presence. Our highly developed technology denies them any possibility of being able to locate us in any way or perceive us in any other way.
Contact Report 721.
That may really be the case, but all the things you have mentioned are really interesting and go a lot further than I had hoped to come to know. But you mentioned that some of your ancestors were also religiously believing ones. What was that like, and what is it like today?
In our very early times, 2. Various religious forms of belief delusion were widespread among all peoples, as a result of which, on all our worlds, the worst Ausartungen and terribleness were also a daily occurrence, as well as malicious wars and terror of all imaginable kinds, whereas religious wars were likewise unavoidable, as also political wars and pure wars of hatred, etc. All this only ended a little over 52,000 years ago, when what came to pass, which I explained to you in a conversation, namely the whole thing that happened with the moment that soothed everything that was evil, wrong, and ausguarded, and so forth. That's when the large metallic spherical structure influenced all populations of each of our worlds by means of swinging waves for 32 days, in such a way that every single human being became clear and conscious of his or her entire ausguarded thought-feeling psychological world. Thus, every single person became frighteningly aware of everything that was lurking and moldering in his or her character and in his or her reflecting and striving, of that which was erroneous and wrong, of that which was evil, loathsome and ausgeartet, and could erupt uncontrollably at any time by the smallest trifle, which was constantly suppressed by the religious belief delusion, but always lurked in the underground and broke through with every possible negative impulsation to wreak terribleness. This bitter cognition led each individual human being to study the personal thought-feeling psyche world and to transform it into a positive equalizedness according to his or her own choosing and free will, which, however, only became possible as the religious belief delusion was dissolved and became insignificant. But it took a long time for this cognition merely to penetrate, after which it took even longer periods of time to free oneself from the belief delusion. Ultimately, it took between 3 and 11 years for each individual human being, depending on their personality, to carry out the necessary developmental change. And in fact, it was not easy for any human being to break away from his or her religious beliefs. Hence, some persons had to fight hard battles with themselves, which some could not endure to the end, and therefore put an end to their lives, as our chronicles tell us. In the end, however, all those who were strong enough were able to overcome everything, and to carry out and win the developmental change through their own arduous efforts. That was more than 52,000 years ago, and since then we Plejaren have been free of belief. We no longer have any religions or sects or belief and are completely free of them. And this has since then given us Plejaren the freedom, without belief delusion in a determination by a Godhead, to determine and direct all and everything ourselves in every respect, to move in every kind and wise in peace and harmony among one another and with one another, to communicate with one another, to work with one another, and to correspondingly live according to the whole in a human-worthy wise. And not a single Plejaren person has wanted to lose this since then, and does not want to lose this in the present time, nor in future time as well, which is why our directives were worked out, which are respected and uncontrovertibly followed by every single person, and determine that it must be strictly prevented that not even a single person of us Plejaren may fall prey to a religious belief delusion ever again. But if this were to happen at some point, then the consequence would be that the person in question would be excluded from our entire community and banished to a humankind on a foreign world, such as to the earth, the humankind of which is just as ausgeartet in its belief delusion as the respective person himself or herself. So it is not only due to the entire Ausartungen of all kinds of the human beings of earth that are wrong and with acts of Gewalt, that we must stay away from them and are not allowed to make direct contacts with them, but also the fact of their religious and sectarian belief delusion. This is the case, because owing to that, as with us in times of old, also on the earth, wars and struggles for might have been waged since time immemorial, acts of terror are carried out, and millionfold murders are committed. Indeed, because of the religious and sectarian belief delusion, all maliciousness, falsehoods, Ausartungen, intrigues, and wantonness, up to murder and killing, buried in the deepest inner nature of the character and suppressed by the belief delusion, and lying in wait to break out as a result of an often only small trifle, very quickly become active and reach the outside to wreak terribleness. And that is exactly what you also teach.
Yes, because it is simply nothing but the truth. But thank you for all that you have done and explained, because everything again allows a valuable insight into your Plejaren history.
Contact Report 722.
What you have learnt from my father, Svath, is more than I now know, for I have now first of all the duty to familiarize myself with his annals, as I also have to look around in our new library, and still have much to fathom and learn. Since our last conversation on the 14th of June, I have not been able to get away from it, and have spent all the time possible to me in fathoming many things and acquiring new knowledge, which is completely new and immeasurable to me. And when I think that you have known all this all your life, but that at my age I have to learn much of it, then I can only bow down before you, Edward, dear friend. And the new learning of the immeasurably extensive knowledge has only now become possible for me, as also for our peoples, because you have made known to us the sign how we could find and open the entrance. Since we have been in contact with each other, you have kept silent about it, which is why I only came across the whole of your real task when I began to study the annals of my father Svath at your request. What I have learned in the library since the 14th of June, at least what I have been able to explore and learn so far, far exceeds my expectations. So I also think that you are now, with your knowledge, which you already learned from my father as a boy and also explored a great deal yourself, as I know from my father's annals, better able to explain the facts we have addressed regarding earthly overpopulation and its destructive manipulations of the planet, its nature, fauna, and flora, the atmosphere, and the climate.
Contact Report 723.
What Yanarara begins, she also finishes correctly. Of course, you can use what Nadista spoke into your device, and which our language experts formulated for her, in our present place of conversation, when you retrieve our conversation and also write it. But now, Edward, dear friend, I want to talk about what has been moving me for some weeks. As you know, I have been preoccupied with my father Svath's notes and with the new library, especially in the last few weeks, which is also why I have not come here. And because you have opened the Sphere Library to us, we have gained extremely extensive knowledge, which on the one hand goes back millions and billions of years, but on the other hand gives us insights, knowledge, education, and much more on a scale we could never have hoped for. Now I want to talk about the fact that I can only now understand what a great task my father Svath took upon himself and fulfilled, but about which he also had to keep silent towards us, just as you also had to keep silent about many things, which is why you also kept silent towards me and all of us all these years. This gave me the impression, in many respects, as I also had with my daughter Simya say and with Quetzal, which the three of us also sometimes talked about, that we had to give you explanations and exemplifications for your understanding in certain matters, individual things, facts, and incidents, etc. And this was not infrequently the case. Although you had more precise knowledge of what we were explaining, and you even often knew more than we did ourselves, and about this I would like to discuss a few things with you after our official conversation and stipulate that you should call up and officially also write down what I have to say so far and also now. In this regard, my father Svath has stated in his annals that you would do this and have given your word to do so. Once I have read through and studied all his records completely, and thus also received all the necessary information. Since we have been in contact with you, I have come to know you as my true, honest, and personal friend, but I only know today that you nevertheless concealed a great deal from me, which I actually did not know, and also never noticed that you knew more than me on various occasions, but did not let this show. This is precisely because you gave your word to my father as a boy to keep silent towards me until I myself became aware of this fact by studying his annals. All this is now so, and thus I can understand your silence and see nothing wrong behind it against me. That your silence is of many kinds, as well as that you had to test us in many ways on my father's behalf by your pretense of ignorance and by certain questions, that I can also understand. For through this we, especially my daughter Simya say, Quetzal and I, have grown into our task and have also dutifully kept to our directives. Edward, dear friend, with regard to the observance of the directives, this also concerns, for example, everything around the Earth foreigners, the future ones and the earthly ones who have always appeared with their flying apparatuses since ancient times, are doing so at present and will continue to do so. Neither about the Earth foreigners and Earth future ones nor of the earthly ones was exact information found in the annals, just as no information was contained therein with regard to many of your questions. This was also true with regard to abductions of Earth humans by Earth foreigners, whereby such abductions were foreign to us, because we have always not cared about them and never made ourselves recognizable to them, and only in the course of the years were able to clarify these things through your questions, and so on. And we did not let ourselves be recognized by them all because, already at the beginning of my father's annals, it was clearly warned against ever coming into contact with the Earth foreigners and the future ones, just as we should also never penetrate into the direct range of their flying apparatus. Likewise, he warned in his annals not to come into contact with the Earthlings and with their equally futuristic flying apparatus, just as we are also to keep away from all their underground bases and underwater stations. And that my father has recorded much in his annals, but has also warned us against contacting the aliens, who probably also do not maintain contact with each other or have no knowledge of each other as it seems to us, but there is no mention of this in the annals. The fact is that 3 groupings of aliens are on Earth, and that all the occurrences and certain related occurrences that have taken place since time immemorial and the appearance of innumerable unknown flying objects of alien life forms correspond to reality. You, however, knew all this in detail, but kept silent about it also to us and pretended to be ignorant, because you were not allowed to speak and you kept to what you were obliged to do. And I now know that you will continue to keep this obligation, because that is now completely clear to me, although I have also become aware that it would be dangerous not only for you, but also for Earth humans, if you were to announce any facts about this, which must continue to remain unspoken for a long time. And this does not only refer to the real facts concerning all groups of aliens with their flying apparatuses, but also to the future of the Earth and its humanity, which unfortunately has not listened to your warnings since the 1940s and is leading the climate towards a collapse, as you and my father have observed in present and future times, whereby the unreasonableness of this Earth human being, blinded by a delusion of a supposed God-creator, has already irrevocably destroyed, annihilated, and exterminated a great deal of the Earth and its entire nature. But what I want to say with regard to our behavior towards you was the result of our ignorance of all the missing knowledge, for this has only now been granted to us, in that you have opened the great spherical library to us. As this opening had been foretold to us for 212 millions of years, that it would one day take place through a successor personality of the Annunciator Nocademion. Our ancient prediction contained only the announcement that in the distant future, in a very distant descendant, a sage of our lineage from the lineage of Nocademion would find the new herald, and he would bring the teaching of Nocademion. Now that through you we have access to the new, great and ancient library that you have opened to us, I have found in an instruction found in the library the complete ancient prediction and have studied it. It says that the new herald for us, Plejaren, is not to be found in our reality, but in another. This new herald, so the prediction reads, will not appear in our reality, but in another reality that is foreign to our space-time structure, and will bring us Plejaren, the teachings of Nocademion, anew. However, there will be a wise man from the peoples of the Plejaren who will find him, teach him, and prepare him for his path and his far-reaching task. And this sage was undoubtedly my father Svath, of which, apart from himself, no one knew anything, so not even we descendants, because he had to keep silent, for which the reason was also given. Only through the entire explanations of the prediction did I now become aware of the implications of it all. And that also only because I was able to find knowledge and explanations in the great library that had been opened, which already at the beginning revealed to me a knowledge that I could not yet grasp and that must be immeasurable. The information, insights, explanations, and knowledge I have gained in the last only 1.5 months alone far surpasses anything I could ever have imagined. In the same way, this will also apply to our entire spiritual leadership and also to all our peoples, whom we will officially let participate in everything. Consequently, we will open up all the information and insights, etc., which we continuously gain from the library to all peoples on all our planets and to all their peoples, to all persons who are interested in it. The interest in this is, of course, individual. So not all individuals of all peoples are interested, as it is also with regard to other things. But it is the absolute majority of every people who are interested in all the far-reaching facts and connections of our billions of years of Plejaren history. But as for the teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, which you have been producing for us for years, it is of very special interest to all peoples, which is why there is not a person who has not turned to it since you made it available to us, Plejaren, which has been the case for nearly 50 years now and has penetrated all our peoples down to the last person, as is undoubtedly the case. But as far as we are concerned, all of us who were in contact with you after my father's departure and who are in contact with you today, so also Asket and Nera, we are all agreed that, I must say, we have actually misled ourselves about your personality. Because first of all, we aligned ourselves very precisely with our directives and refrained from any enlightenment about your personality. This is because we saw no right in doing so, as this also applies to every other person, whose personality and private sphere must remain inviolable for us, as our directives stipulate and we follow them, as this is observed without exception by all our Plejaren peoples down to the last person. Consequently, quarrels are unknown everywhere, as, on the contrary, is disgracefully the case with the Earth humans, as a result of which discord, hatred, and violence prevail all around, and very often mischief is caused. But just as we have restrained ourselves with regard to your person, so we have also done in other respects, such as, for example, towards the Earth foreigners and rare Earth future beings, who since time immemorial have made themselves known on Earth again and again with their flying apparatus, just as the earthly powers in this respect have also done. But we will continue to do so, because this is determined by our directives, which is why we do not know too much about these groupings. But this is also good for us, because in this way we do not run the risk of being confronted with anything that could force us to take defensive measures and relapse into the same warlike behavior as was the case more than 52,000 years ago with our ancestors of that time. And since we now know, especially I through my father's annals, that you have much better knowledge of these three foreign forces than we have, because we have always been careful not to make ourselves recognizable to them, and will also avoid doing so in the future, I have the wish to receive more detailed information from you. But according to everything I have read in my father's annals, it was correct that we never let ourselves be recognized by these alien flying objects. Although we did well to keep a low profile and not to make ourselves recognizable to the aliens, on the other hand, we did not gain any knowledge that might have been of importance to us. I must also mention that you were not allowed to talk about the connections with the flying apparatuses, about which you always pretended to be ignorant, and also asked questions as if you were completely ignorant, although you had much more knowledge about everything than we did. Nevertheless, it was correct that you remained silent, as you were instructed to do by my father, because in this way we learned to protect ourselves and also came to insights that were important for us. Your lifelong silence, which you have to keep in this respect, corresponds in my opinion to something, and also in many other matters, which actually a human being cannot keep, because probably everyone would sooner or later lose control over it and speak carelessly and therefore unintentionally.
Contact Report 725.
The longer, the more I realized that your father's misgivings were unnecessary, for you adhere so strictly to your directives, as you have done for over 52,000 years, and thereby preserve everything that was then triggered by the swinging waves of the sphere and led to what you Plejaren exist and maintain today in peace, freedom, and righteousness. And now, as to all else that is written, that concerns
Contact Report 727.
Thank you. But now, Edward, I have news to tell you that will probably amaze you as much as it did with me when I came across something of my father's in the now open library, which I will call the Secret Annals.
Contact Report 728.
I can also only say that this is primarily due to the stupidity of the organizers and all those taking part in such events, because they want to appear great and humane in front of the people, but can neither guess nor understand what evil they are thereby conjuring up. Such stupid and ill-considered commemorative events were also common among our Plejaren peoples in earlier times, namely 53,000 years ago, before final peace and humanity finally dissolved all evils. Then, however, a profound psychological insight and instruction of a denunciation led to a complete cessation and a comprehensive prohibition of further such commemorations. Basically, the psychological insights into such commemorations prove that, in some ways, they trigger exactly the opposite of commemoration and peace, as well as forgiveness and forgetting. Because in remembrance of earlier malicious events, they evoke hateful emotions in former victims and their descendants and sympathizers, as well as in extreme dissident groups, for example, neo-Nazis. However, this is also the case with other persons who support those things, machinations and crimes, etc., for which the commemorations are organized. This creates acts of hatred and violence, and thus all the more the opposite of what is stupidly and falsely expected and intended from such events. Since the organizers and fellow travelers of such commemorations are largely psychologically uneducated, which also applies to the majority of all earthly psychologists themselves, who believe themselves to be God, the truth in this respect is neither accepted nor understood. Consequently, hate and malicious actions, deeds, violence and destruction, etc., continue to be provoked in a very stupid way among extremists who think differently. This is in addition to the fact that through such commemorations, various commercial interests are abused for profit and the participants of the events are financially robbed. As far as the change is concerned, according to earthly chronology, it occurred 61,000 years before, a little more than 52,000 years ago. The great spherical object known to you traveled around our worlds for 32 days each, and through its vibrational influence, all our peoples were pacified. This pacification event was preceded, however, by a general change of ratio in all our peoples through the teachings of a personality from the direct lineage of the primordial herald Nocademion, who was highly respected, but only after our peoples, who at that time were still stubborn and bound to violence, accepted her teachings and began to follow them. And just as our humanities on all worlds looked up to their herald then, I myself also have the same honor and reverence to witness today.
Ta, please do not do that. You know I do not like that. So please. Please, Ta, please. We are friends and, damn it, please go on about what other information you dug up in the new library. Please.
Excuse me, dear friend, excuse me, I did not mean to. Good. I have only gained the information mentioned earlier in the last few days through records in the new Orb library, for it was unknown to me, as it was to all our peoples until a few days ago, which is why the new knowledge is already being spread to all our worlds, as is our custom when new information arises. All our peoples are very interested in this matter and want to know what can be found in the new library. The new knowledge I have been able to acquire in this respect also shows that it was only through the ratio Wandel, which took place 61,000 years ago before the pacification more than 52,000 years ago. I calculated back from the present time about 113,000 years ago that the triggering factor was created for all the human beings of our worlds to come to their senses. And this reflection was such that all the Plejaren peoples on all our worlds accepted the teachings of our Annunciator and allowed themselves to be guided by reason or by understanding and reason in such a way that a change came about within them in a positive and progressive way. According to the chronistic records, however, this only gradually came to fruition when the majority of the peoples realized that all his degenerations were fundamentally founded in his religious faith and that his thoughts, actions, deeds, and behavior, etc., arose over and over again from his faith. However, only when they realized this did they also realize that their faith in God was so deeply rooted in them that all their degenerations, all their thoughts, actions, and behavior were not consciously controlled by them, but insidiously, unconsciously, through their religious delusion. This realization caused a far-reaching shock reaction in the majority of all peoples and the perception of the effective real reality, whereby they finally realized their degrading degenerations and were able to define them in the course of time, which was impossible for them before, because everything happened completely unconsciously through their delusion, and thus in the name of God. This realization led to the perception of their false and misleading religious faith dependence with regard to reality and truth, and to the realization that their views, opinions, and considerations were always unconsciously, without being able to determine this themselves, influenced by their faith and arising from their delusion in this respect. This led to the fact that the old Plejaren peoples gradually began to think consciously for themselves, to consider and thereby also to decide for themselves. Consequently, they thereby became free in themselves and discarded their belief in a deity and everything connected with it. In the course of time, which lasted for thousands of years, they thus gained complete independence and freedom and finally detached themselves from all religious faith, which, as on earth, had brought religious wars, religious persecutions, hatred, murder, degenerations, destruction, and, for many millennia, endless misfortune to all peoples as a result of religious fanaticism. By finally renouncing all delusional belief in deities and forbidding all religious cults, an awareness of the knowledge of the doctrine of creation, which you teach here on earth and call the doctrine of truth, the doctrine of the energy of creation, the doctrine of life, developed in our peoples during the next 61,000 years. Through the teaching, profound positive changes took place in all peoples on all our worlds in relation to a consistent use of intellect, reason, and an effective, true humanity. Consequently, also a self-improving ability for controlled and further development of the intellect emerged. This also led to the opposing of everything that was not right, such as all hatred, all violence and criminality, all terrorist organizations, and all organizations of crime, which existed among the earlier Plejaren peoples, just as such have existed on Earth for a very long time. All these degenerations had therefore to be ended by the will of the peoples wherever there still existed unteachable people who, in spite of all the changes of the majority of the peoples, remained in their old degenerations and did not care for any teachings, but continued to do their mischief. Thus, on a planetary scale, the majority of all peoples of all worlds put an end to everything in comprehensive actions by I. And thus, a re-emergence of the whole of these misanthropic degenerations was prevented for all times. By then, and so was.
Excuse me, I cannot write that openly when recalling our conversation, although it would actually be very important, so that it could and should also be carried out here on Earth, which would be good and of right and would put an end to everything that would put terror organizations, crime organizations, criminality, wars, violence and murder and manslaughter, etc., in closed bounds for all time. If, however, I were to write openly how and what was done by the ancient Plejaren peoples, then an unparalleled uprising and war would be triggered here on Earth by the majority of all God-fearers or God-delusionists. This is precisely because their delusion of faith would not permit such an action on our world, as would also be the case with all false humanists, although the whole thing would be neither inhuman nor illogical, but correct and just.
I suppose that would be so. Consequently, it is certainly good if, in recalling our conversation, you do not write openly what I have elaborated. Nevertheless, I must say that such action and corresponding actions, as our former Plejaren peoples have carried out everything, would also bring an end to human degenerations on Earth. But this would require that after an Earth-wide action, as I have called it, had been carried out, the whole would henceforth be controlled in the same way, and thus a re-emergence of such degenerations could no longer come about and would be prevented.
But the whole thing would be the perfect solution.
That would indeed be so. But now I should add the following to my previous remarks. Through the whole of the transformation, in the course of the millennia, positive talents, cleverness, a sense of responsibility, sagacity, farsightedness, powers of observation, a sense of perception, powers of thinking, powers of intelligence and wisdom, as well as a constant urge for further education, a faculty of knowledge and many other values have resulted. This overall development was then, after 61,000 years of learning and life fulfillment according to the doctrine of creation, the factor through which the appearance of the sphere became a reality, through which the pacification of all Plejaren peoples and of each individual Plejaren human being then became a final reality. This, however, only became possible when all human beings of all Plejer worlds, in the course of the millennia, largely followed the teaching of the Annunciator. For this was the prerequisite for the appearance of the orb, for so it is written in the records of the New Library.
That is really interesting. Then it was plausible that the giant sphere, whereby the actual change to the final peace behavior of the Plejaren peoples was brought about, only appeared at a time that ensured that the effect of the swinging waves from the spherical structure would also actually bring success.
Contact Report 733.
I can only confirm what my father taught you and what you have experienced yourself. All homeopathy and Bach flower remedies, as well as all others in the same or similar framework, correspond to a nonsense, because as remedies or palliatives of these genera and species, they are all completely useless. Therefore, if human beings who take such pseudo-medicines in faith or otherwise use them because they believe in their efficacy, they fall prey to self-deception, and thus to a fraud of faith, as is also the case with every religious or otherwise sectarian belief, because all products of this kind and also all beliefs are false and utterly useless. If, however, after taking such pseudo-remedies or otherwise administering them to the body, or on the basis of a belief, an improvement reaction, etc. occurs, then the whole thing is by no means the result of such a pseudo-remedy or of a prayer of faith, etc., but with 100% certainty solely of a profound delusion or delusional belief, which undoubtedly corresponds to a placebo effect. Such an effect is delusional and is caused by a so-called placebo or a placebo drug, just as it is caused by every delusion of God, which in no way corresponds to a drugless remedy nor to a God help, because in both cases nothing active is present and consequently nothing exists. Therefore, a placebo or dummy medicine does not contain any medicinal substance, then it cannot have any pharmacological effect that could cause and bring about a recovery. Just as a delusion of God through prayers and ritual acts cannot bring about any help from God, but only a placebo effect that the human being brings about himself through the energy and power of his delusion of faith. So this is the case with religious delusion, just as it is with homeopathy and Bach flowers and all kinds of other worthless remedies and sham medicines that are supposed to function as cures but are really only placebos, which can also apply to sham operations, for example. However, this has already been discussed several times, so we should not elaborate on it wordily once more. As far as euthanasia is concerned, as well as acute suicide, and how we Plejaren think about it and deal with it, I would like to explain that such inhumane methods of exiting life were also practiced by us in very early times, before our distant ancestors found their way to respect for life. This was more than 52,000 years ago, and since then there has never been a single person who killed himself or got rid of his life with the help of others. We Plejaren respect our life, as well as the life of all life forms of every species and kind, for each is given by creation, and as such is to be respected, appreciated, and honored in every situation and in every state and condition. To kill oneself or to do so with the help of others corresponds to a shamefulness and abysmal cowardice towards life, and above all, to an unforgivable injustice, and, moreover, to murder. The whole thing is also to be judged as profound malice and irresponsible disregard towards the creative existential law of life preservation, as this prescribes that everything and anything should always continue to exist, and also develop in the best possible way. And that this is so and corresponds to the truth, proves itself by the endless evolution of everything visibly existing, which constantly adapts itself to new changing natural situations, develops anew and keeps itself alive, as this is particularly evident in free nature.
Contact Report 748.
Now, in response to your explanation, it is to be explained that the basic justification given for our directive is founded precisely in the explanations I have just given, which expresses the fact that we Plejaren would endanger ourselves in our peaceful, righteous, and self-controlling behavior in contacts with Earth humans through their inherent degenerations. This, then, should we violate our directives and come into contact with Earth humans who are still altogether subject to the bias and degenerations of that which I have elaborated and explained. The whole reason why we cling to our directives and prevent ourselves from entering into direct or other closer contact with Earth humans is based on the fact that we Plejaren are not immune to the degenerations of all kinds which are peculiar to Earth humans, but are just as susceptible to them as is also uncontrollably inherent in Earth humans themselves. It is true that for more than 52,000 years we Plejaren have been endowed with peace and righteousness, and we cultivate a culture of freedom and adherence to creative laws as well as personal control, self-respect, and self-control, just as to a certain degree an uninfluenceability is also inherent in us. Nevertheless, and this is unfortunately the case, there is still the danger of external influences which we have to defend ourselves against in order not to fall prey to false, negative, evil, and bad influences. If this were to happen, however, there would be an inevitable consequence of transmission and spreading in our peoples. Even a single human being as the bearer of such catastrophic deformities as are peculiar to Earth humans would be enough to pass on these disastrous evil values and thus infect our peoples with the malignant behavior. In a short time, all our Plejaren peoples would lapse into the same behavior as that which prevails among Earth humans, and consequently everything would return to the way it also prevailed among us more than 52,000 years ago. The fact is that degenerated human behavior, especially among the majority of Earth humans, has grown out of control and produces a suggestive wave which in a short time spreads to other human beings, influences them, transforms them, and makes them act in the same way as those who live out their degenerations, transmitting them suggestively by word and swinging wave to other human beings who then begin to think, act, and behave in the same way. And this is exactly what we Plejaren must avoid, which is the reason why we would not establish or cultivate any contact with Earth humans. We, and indeed all our peoples, are not yet in a stage of evolution which would liberate and immunize us from such negative, malignant, degenerate, and profoundly character degenerations and behavior as these primitive degenerations are still peculiar to Earth humans. The life-threatening process which my father Svath and you have been able to undergo in order to be immune to all these and many other degenerations and, moreover, to be of a different nature, has never been possible for our peoples. That is, also for all those who carry on their activity on Earth and with you, and that includes me. However, we should not talk about this in all openness, just as you should also not let anything else be known. This will also remain so for a long time, consequently we have to be patient and keep ourselves from contact with any Earth humans. That was also the reason why we asked you at that time whether you would act as a mediator if we could have achieved a possible mediator contact with the leaders of the USA, the Soviet Union, and China, since you should have taken over the task of the mediator. But since the 3 letters did not reach their destination, because they were misappropriated by your confidants and not delivered to the recipients, everything dissolved before even a first statement could have been made by the leaders of the time. In the USA, Carter, and then Reagan. In the Soviet Union, Brezhnev. In China, Ye Jianying. There is no more to be said about this or about anything.
Contact Report 768.
Therefore, I can now also call up the information concerning the subject matter at hand, and the necessary answers from my personal memory bank block created by Svath for this purpose, as I have always had to do for years with all factual explanations, because it had become impossible for me to keep all the relevant data in my memory, as the whole thing would also not be possible for any other human being, because altogether, everything corresponds to a great deal more than what a human memory would be able to grasp at all. The whole of what has been learned and stored in the course of a very long time, which exceeds a normal human lifetime, as well as through all the times of the line of the Nocademion, would probably fill a small library, and to store it in a human memory, to hold it and to recall it again, is simply a matter of impossibility for a human being. And with this, what I have just said, I am also answering the multiple questions of many persons as to how it is possible for me to retain all the diverse knowledge that I have collected in a very long learning process. Effectively, I could never store and preserve it all in my memory, therefore a special energetic memory bank was created for my person by Svath, in which all the knowledge I have learned has been stored in code for the duration of my life, in order to be able to retrieve it, decode it, and reproduce it verbally and in writing when needed. Besides this, a similar memory block consists of the entire line of the Nocademion with all data up to all time, from which I can also retrieve information and reproduce it verbally or in writing, but it requires the necessity of immediately converting all code values to be retrieved from the memory blocks into the language form and into consistent sentence forms.
Contact Report 770.
You may be right, but it really is a case of talking for the cat, because the bulk of humanity is insane and prefers to hang onto a dear God and an Allah and Buddha, or whatever all of them are called, instead of thinking for themselves and deciding for themselves and acting.
You remind me of our history, because our ancestors needed millions of years before they could free themselves from their belief in God. It was only about 52,000 years ago that they found themselves, and that too only through a
huge spherical structure, I know.
Yes, it was the salvation of our ancestors. It cost many human lives, but since then we have had peace, no more crime and no more hatred. Human beings think, decide, and act freely, without any belief in a God and the like. They are, contrary to the God-believing Earth humans, completely free from a faith and live in peace and freedom, without the burden of money and greed for power, as the Earth humans do contrary to this.
That would be what should also be the case with earthly humanity. But these are wishful dreams, for there are very few who are interested in the effective truth. For the bulk of earthlings prefer to listen to the delusion of God, to the sectarianism that keeps them enslaved and in bondage.
Contact Report 779.
What can I say about that? Because the work that is being done by the scientists is great, considering that they were never aware before of these destructive religious energies that have taken on a life of their own. It was unknown to me, as it is to all of us, for we do not know of any religious faith and consequently also of any energies that come into being through it and cause mischief, confuse the thoughts of human beings and make them dependent on faith in a God or God-creator who does not exist. Our peoples were probably also believers in a deity in much earlier times, but more than 52,000 years ago, this all changed due to the sudden appearance of the Great Sphere, about which you know more than we do and about which you are not allowed to say anything. Today, all human beings of our peoples think, decide, and act independently, without still believing anything religious. Consequently, everything that corresponds to a belief of any kind has also disappeared in daily life, which is why all human beings nowadays get to the bottom of every matter before they accept something as truth. In this way, lies and thus quarrels are also avoided, and peace reigns all around our world. Of course, there are disagreements in certain circumstances, but they never turn into quarrels and are settled before anything unpleasant can happen. If, however, the recordings I see here again are genuine, and indeed they seem to be, then they clearly show what you have known since that time when you saw with my father Svath, that the invention of NT had fallen into the hands of the Nazis and was further developed by them. That means, which you knew, that NT's plans for the invention were found and further developed by the Allies at the end of the war, just as the plans were passed on through espionage and their data further developed, from which they came to fruition. If the Nazi researchers who were working on it at the time had been able to complete the invention completely and before Hitler, together with his wife, who had married him shortly before, was shot by his servants in his bunker in Berlin, then he would have become the ruler of the world with this weapon.
Contact Report 780.
This is correct. As you know, we are not allowed to enter our great library, but we are given the opportunity to obtain any information from it if we feel we need it. So I learned that today your task is to address the Earth humans via the internet, through certain information given in the form of conversations, etc., but also in the form of treatises, by which I mean articles and the contact reports, etc., as written in the old predictions in the library on Era. I think, however, that the writings, as is just stated, are to be given directly to those of both sexes who are interested. By this I understand that in this respect there is talk of your books and other writings, which unfortunately, due to the high costs of production, can only be given away for a certain appropriate fee, that is to say, for a certain price, because everything on earth depends on it. You should not get rich, but the expenses must be covered if everything is to continue. The information in the librarian predictions is also kept in such a way that the emergence of a religion or religious similarity from the community brought into being by you is to be avoided. Consequently, only Earth's human beings are to be accepted into it who are able to open their consciousness in intellect and reason for the effective truth and search for it, just as they are also willing to banish everything religious and sectarian from their thoughts and consciousness through their own decision. Thus, via the Internet, the necessary information material should actually be disseminated for reading, nothing more, for it should not be animating, but informative and in such a way that the Earth human reading this information begins to cultivate independent thoughts and thus, in the course of time, finds the effective truth, which is arranged very far from any religiosity and sectarianism. Mouth-to-ear information is also to be done, through which those Earth humans will become aware of the teaching who really want to think for themselves and find the way to the teaching. However, everything should not be such that it amounts to a conviction, but everything should always only be informative. Consequently, it should only appeal to those Earth humans who understand and know how to use their intellect and reason independently and are therefore not believers. That is what it says in the predictions and instructions I have received from the library so far.
Contact Report 781.
That you cannot find what you are looking for in Svatha's annals. That was recorded separately by him. I know that. So you will not find what you are looking for in the annals, because you have to request it elsewhere in the library, namely under the code word.
Contact Report 791.
That the religious faith of Earth humans is the greatest evil that ever exists on the planet, and thus can never ever become true peace among human beings, that corresponds to a fact that will never be understood by the believers in religion, that is to say, in God. The religious belief of Earth's human beings in a God who created everything and watches over humanity guarantees the superiors of all religions that the believers under this Earth humans can be ruled and controlled at will. The realization that every religious belief is truthfully absolute nonsense and causes negative energies as well as misbehavior in the human being is used by all the superiors of the religions to abuse the whole of faith to the point of bondage and other dependence of the believers for all conceivable purposes. Sexual abuse of believers, mainly women, children, and adolescents, but also men, is a common practice of leaders of faith, as we very often observe from multiple observations. This is so since ancient times, hence it is not a phenomenon of modern times. This evil appears among the representatives of all faiths, and indeed among all the main religions and other religious and non-religious faiths known to us to exist on earth. It is therefore not only a phenomenon that occurs in Catholicism, as is erroneously generally assumed, but a phenomenon that runs through all earthly faiths without exception. Even many among those who publicly profess to be opponents of this action do nothing else in their minds, but accuse the known wrongdoers of their doings, though they do or did the same thing secretly, for which, however, they have not yet been openly called to account, because as yet their doings have not been exposed. However, as far as freeing oneself from religious faith is concerned, which also has to be addressed, this only becomes possible and arises in human beings when they really honestly and consciously concern themselves with freeing themselves from all religious faith. For this, however, it is necessary that he recognize the whole reality of that which he himself is and embodies, that which he calls God and Creator. So he must realize that no imaginary God stands over him, watching and keeping everything alive, but he himself. He guides and leads himself, protects his life and shapes everything himself, creates his achievements, controls his thoughts, decisions and actions, and determines what he performs. But the human being must first recognize this. Also, the fact that thinking and thus religious belief is an energetic might that dominates the human being, and that he, if he is really a believer, is held captive by this really very fast and strongly possessive energy of belief. This is not harmless in its nature and power, which I still have to mention, because Arlian has said that I should suggest to you to consciously take up a defensive attitude against it. Because again, not only the entire electronics will be disturbed by it, but also your health and energy will be attacked. You should pay special attention to your health in the future. But as far as religious faith is concerned, our faith-captured Plejaren peoples also had to recognize and learn the truth about this over 50,000 years ago. This led to a great many of them ending their own lives. In the course of time, only those remained who began to cultivate their own thoughts, devised their own decisions, and carried out their own determined actions. And there also remained those who were fickle and who, between religious faith and the reality of reality, ultimately chose the latter. Consequently, all religions and every human being whose faith very quickly became void and extinguished, and the result was that human beings became peaceful. This very quickly became established, as the nonsense of all religiosity and religious belief was recognized by the human beings themselves and reduced to absurdity. This gave rise to religion-free peoples who, without any religious belief, have now lived in peace and harmony for more than 50,000 years, because 1. The quarrels between the various religions were resolved, and 2. The human beings learned to think for themselves, and also to decide logically, rationally, and reasonably. Consequently, they also learned to act accordingly. This was also learned by the humanities and peoples belonging to our federation, for our ancestors endeavored to spread their new way of thinking and their new way of living and the necessary understanding of it, which was accepted and realized by all humanities in a short time.
And the great orb at that time that had started all this, was that involved in that also with the Federated?
Yes, that is how it is handed down to us. But when I hear you talk like this, what you have said and quoted, then I understand the great problem that exists for the peoples of the earthly industrial nations concerning the refugees. There would undoubtedly have to be worthy rulers at
Contact Report 802.
That is so, and it will continue to be so. Besides, it has been around 20 million years since our distant ancestors first came to Earth, and they kept themselves largely under wraps, as did those who followed them all this time after. It has remained so to this day, because it was forbidden even then, which remains so to this day, for the Plejaren to spread out into another universe of creation than just their own dimension. Special regulation arose very early concerning the sister universe, that is to say, the DAL universe. Consequently, 2 Plejaren peoples were allowed to settle there. So the Sonair and those you know as the people from whom Asket originated.
Yes, I know all this from Sim Yase, for she already told me everything. Svath, your father, has also told me a lot. And so I also know that the Plejaren used to be warrior peoples, and only became peaceful a little more than 52,000 years ago with the appearance of the orb, which you were then able to enforce throughout the Federation. It would be nice if this could also be or become the case on Earth, but it would be illusory to hope for that. The 10 billion human beings who will soon be on this Earth, of whom around 14,000 die every year due to environmental pollution, as you said at the end of last year, is a huge problem, because the majority of this humanity is unfortunately still deeply attuned to murder and manslaughter, which comes to the surface at every possible and impossible opportunity. No one teaches them that they must consciously change for the good, that they must bring themselves under control, consciously, regarding their evil ambitions lurking deep in their character, in order to become truly human beings. I have been aware since Svatha's time that the so-called free will of human beings is absolutely illusory, and that this is therefore non-existent, for truly they must create it for themselves, for it is not naturally given to them. In addition, many external influences are pressing upon him which choke off his free will to such an extent that it is impossible for him to simply have it. Consequently, he has to work hard to acquire it, which is only possible if he is able to bring himself under his absolute self-control. This means, however, that he must seal himself off from the outside world in every conceivable way, and must consciously and profoundly reduce all his evil, false and therefore negative ambitions that are deeply embedded in his character to such an extent that they can no longer unconsciously break through to the outside world and cause mischief. Well, human beings believe that they can decide freely in this and that wise, but conscious decisions are always preceded by certain processes that are determined, that is to say, predetermined, for example, by given rules, orders, behavior or laws, etc. Free will, that is to say, freedom of will, as I learned from Svath, is that it is not a conscious decision of the will that determines the actions of human beings, but an unconscious activity of the brain, which means that it is causal, that is to say, dependent in terms of cause and effect, and reacts accordingly. If this is not consciously controlled, then the result is that the ambitions that are deeply anchored in the character break through to the outside in a flash and trigger the corresponding action, which are usually ambitions of the bad, evil, negative, and of murder and manslaughter, hatred, revenge and retaliation, war and discord, etc. Also included are the lust for power, the lust for domination, the lust for prestige, jealousy, as well as every other addiction and everything else that is harmful to the personality and character, and also external influences of every kind, etc., and they break through immediately at the slightest unconscious activity, that is to say, stirring of the brain, and trigger the action determined in it. If, however, this ambition, which lies deep in the character, is not consciously controlled and neutralized, then the activation of an impulse in the brain inevitably takes place, and consequently the corresponding action inevitably results. The result is that the human being has no freedom of will, that is to say, no free will, because the negative ambitions stored deep in the character, that is to say, the positive ones, have not been reduced in a controlled manner, and so, through an unconscious activity of the brain, they usually maliciously break through. However, to eliminate these in a controlled manner, so that they are dissolved and neutralized, requires conscious control on the part of the human being, which he must laboriously acquire in such a way that he himself and willingly decides to take this control upon himself, and to positively bring his own free will to bear against all other willing activities of the brain, precisely in such a way that in this respect, a personal freedom of will is given, which cannot be controlled by an unconscious independent activity of the brain, but in a controlled self-willed manner. But if this does not happen, then the evil, bad and negative ambitions deeply embedded in the basis of the character automatically break through an unconscious activity of the brain, such as hatred, revenge and retaliatory behavior, murder and manslaughter, and all evil in general, which the human being has not consciously and willingly brought under control and dissolved and controlled in such a way that they are not triggered by any impulses, outside influences, emotions, etc., nor by an activity of the brain. And this process for control, and that logic, understanding and reason can come into play, requires that the human being creates for himself what his freedom of will really is, for this alone guarantees what he can work out as free will and freedom of will. This is the only kind of free will that the human being really has, for no other freedom of will is given to him, and this he must work out for himself.
Contact Report 811.
I know that because your neutrality thinking is known to me by the fact that I am deeply involved with your approach to life.
Aha, and how do you know this one?
That results from the fact that on Era we are publicly informed about your life story and everything that happens around you and on Earth. This is also in the sense that everything that Svath has left behind in terms of knowledge about you and what he has experienced with him will be made public. This is very, very much, and everything will be made known little by little since you made it possible for us to enter and use the Great Library.
I did not know that. But then I do not have to know everything.
That is so with you. I know that from Ptah, because you never ask what is done with us on Era with the extensive knowledge that Svath has handed down everything.
Contact Report 813.
But if I now return to the events on Earth, then it is to be said that we Plejaren do not take sides with the belligerents in Ukraine, on both sides. That is to say, neither with Ukraine, nor with Russia, nor in any other way with other states in any other matters, but remain neutral throughout. This is our general Plejaren behavior throughout, which was created by our early ancestors more than 52,000 years ago as a general rule of that, and has ensured us ever since that we can deal peacefully with each other privately, politically and in every other wise, and thus preserve peace, freedom, and humanity. Also, any behavior of power, hatred, theft, murder, and the like, as well as strife, etc., is foreign to us, and therefore not our own. Consequently, we must strictly guard against it here on Earth, and must not come into direct contact with Earth humans. Although we are not very susceptible to all the evil behavior that is unfortunately common among Earth humans, our directives nevertheless forbid any direct or indirect contact with Earth's human beings. Only in the form of indirect mediation would this have been possible. But in the meantime, owing to the grave incorrigibility and evil of the bulk of Earth's humanity, this is no longer in keeping with the directives.
Contact Report 818.
The neutrality of the peoples of the Plejaren has represented various state leaders of the Federation for more than 52,000 years and preserves their security and the peace of the state. And our humanity cannot comprehend that here on Earth, and especially in Switzerland, useless state leaders and other powerful elements that destroy neutrality and thus the peace and security of the state are tolerated. In addition, all the foundations of life of earthly humanity, nature, its fauna and flora, as well as all the ecosystems of the planet and the planet itself are also being destroyed by the exploitation of its resources in such a way that any reparation is already close to the brink of impossibility. The emergence of worldwide overpopulation and thus of the Earth humans' irresponsible excessive procreation and birth of offspring, permitted and uncontrolled by the state, has had the effect that thousands of genera and species of wildlife forms have already been wiped out without salvation and, in addition, has caused environmental pollution so that everything and anything of the naturally viable is rapidly and ever more rapidly approaching total and irrevocable destruction.
Contact Report 819.
You have really, as you say, hit the nail on the head with that. For I think it is necessary for once to explain that we do not come here to Earth simply to satisfy our interest. But to my explaining you shall be silent and not interrupt me in my speech, for it is necessary that once what should have been explained long ago should be explained. Fundamentally, the discovery of a natural dimensional gate, still unknown to our very early ancestors, was the beginning of the whole of your mission. When it happened that about 25 million years ago a lunar structure penetrated this gate, which then found its way into this universe and to Earth, and pushed away another lunar structure of little more than 1,000 kilometers in diameter, which was later captured by the giant planet Saturn. A group of explorers had also followed this lunar formation and thus found their way to Earth, which has since been visited again and again by our distant descendants, who brought a great many life forms, plants and other goods with them to our planet, which at that time was still called Minator, but was renamed Era about 52,000 years ago, when the time of peace spread to our world. Everything old was supposed to be in the past, and so everything that seemed important to our ancestors was given new names, which is why the name of our planet was also subordinated to these changes and given the designation era, which in our language, which has remained the same since then and has not changed, meant something like soil and earth. This planetary designation was also used when a distant descendant of Nocademion first came to this Earth world about 280,000 years ago and decided that the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life should also be brought into this universe, that is to say, into this dimension of creation and thus to Earth. Thus it came about that via the level Arahat Athersata, later on, at a certain time, downborn energies of the Nocademion could be born on Earth, which then happened for the first time about 14,000 years ago, after which this then further came about with Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, Muhammad, and you. The name of our planet, however, that is to say era, remained, and was then also adopted in the Latin language on Earth, but changed to terra, which meant something like land, and was later also interpreted as earth. This is basically what you should have explained openly many years ago, but which you never did, despite all your work. Why you have concealed this, I cannot understand, because it explains why you, as a distant descendant of Nocademion, are active here on Earth, as well as why the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, is taught on the planet Earth through you.
Contact Report 821.
There you are back. It was about 15 minutes and your coming is correct because I just finished the drawings. If you want to write on these, this is Jeremiah, this portrait is Elijah, and this is Muhammad. You can be sure that the drawings really do represent the likeness of Elijah, Jeremiah, and Muhammad, and that is as I remember the pictures that are kept with us in the library ball.
I have no doubt about that. And as I look at your works, I remember that they really do look like those pictures I saw in the library. Thank you very much for your work.
Contact Report 831.
You will not make any friends if you openly say it is approaching what in earlier times the rulers in their lust for power, violence and injustice exercised on the peoples, namely that they were exploited, tortured, and murdered in every conceivable manner. This has been preserved in later times and up to the present day, but in a different form, which has become more deceitful, vile, and detestable in this respect. Much is happening today so infamously hidden that it is not known to the peoples, which is why the striving for more power of the state powers and all financial institutions has not only promoted their criminality, crime and corruption in such a wise that, in imitating them, everything similar has also taken hold in the populations, so that all this can no longer be changed. According to our investigations and findings, all this has taken on such degenerations in the last 150 years that a new form has arisen which has been spreading more and more for years, namely the electronic one, which has not proved itself in the long run with regard to the payment of purchasable goods and finally the payment for work. This was the experience of our ancestors, which is why the means of payment for all kinds of goods and wages for work were completely abolished by U.S. Plejaren some 52,000 years ago since we turned to peace. This also had the consequence that all financial crime and crimes of the same kind immediately became a thing of the past and never appeared again. All production sites for any kind of goods became the common property of all peoples, while work was no longer paid for with wages because no means of payment were necessary anymore, because everything desired and necessary for life could be acquired without them. In the course of time, as a result of more modern technology, working hours were also reduced, so that today only 2 working hours per day are required per person to do what has to be done. However, this is not possible through overpopulation, as is the case on Earth because even the most modern technology cannot achieve this, but only a moderate total population of less than 1 billion, which is therefore adapted to the planet. Our era is about the same size as the Earth, so our world population is correctly only 530 million, which would also correspond to the Earth's humanity, which is also what the Earth's population should strive for. The massive overpopulation that prevails on the Earth, however, brings with it, as a consequence of far too rapid technological development, all the degenerations that have already arisen and are still arising as a result of the ill-considered and far too rapid development of technology about which Earth humans give no real thought. They simply allow themselves to be irresponsibly and thoughtlessly driven by the mania for technological development, whereby they drift more and more away from logic, understanding, and reason, as well as from reality. Through the unreasonably fast technological development, which is obviously uncontrollable by Earth humans, they bring forth a very rapid technological development of artificial intelligence, which is simply an attempt to be able to manage human thinking, working, and acting, etc. electronically. This also applies to computer technology, to which all and anything is to be transferred, and thus also to give it artificial intelligence. This, however, is highly dangerous in all respects, because instead of everything being programmed into the artificial intelligence for each individual step and purpose in a logical and very careful and deliberate manner, the artificial intelligence is inadequately programmed for safety so that it can ultimately take on a life of its own. This means that the artificial intelligence can then find answers and solve problems on its own without the human beings being able to do anything about it. As a consequence, it might also automatically take over the leadership in the matter for which it is programmed, if it does not already do so independently, in order to ultimately determine, program, and execute everything and anything itself, without the human being able to do anything about it. In this manner, Earth humans are on the way to one day being dominated, enslaved, and harassed by artificial intelligence, as had also happened to our distant ancestors, who were only able to become free of everything again by abruptly destroying all artificial intelligences before they realized that they had been destroyed. This had to be done by a secretly organized agreement, otherwise it would not have been possible to free oneself from the artificial intelligence. Such a procedure, however, should not be possible on the Earth due to the catastrophic overpopulation and the division of many states, because a unity of the state powers will not be possible if it should come to that. The state powers and financial institutions will dominate the peoples in such a manner, as Father wrote in his annals, that a recommended uncontrollable and irresponsible development will come from them, which is due to the emergence and effect of the much too rapid development of technology, as it is also due to a very negative change in the brains of the majority of Earth humans, namely the brain organ, which is also known as the prefrontal cortex by Earth experts, but which will be very strongly and permanently affected. This is the true conscious as well as self-responsible thinking in the majority of Earth humans, which has degenerated in the last 250 years to such an extent that logic, understanding, and reason have been replaced by abnormality. The consequence of this was that sensing and striving changed and became oriented towards the fact that, as in earlier times, belief in the imaginary could again spread generally among the mass of the majority of the Earth's humanity. This opened the way to new delusions, to new imaginings, to a new delusion of God, to a delusion of wealth, to a delusion of being important and known, to a delusion of watching sport, to a delusion of discordant sounds and singing, etc. Self-promotion. Becoming known and important and presenting oneself in the coming television also takes place, as Father's annals say, through the fact that fame addiction increases in forms that no longer know any limits and is striven for through violence and murder, as well as dangerousness and degeneracy in every way. The only important thing is to be publicly known everywhere, as well as to be financially rich in excess or against all order, decency, and morality. Otherwise, however, yesterday I came across, while reading the annals, that I may mention more than before that with regard to those who are simply called foreigners by us, I may openly say that my father Sfath and you observed them already in early times. In this respect, especially their ancestors on earth, how they have wrought and in some cases allowed themselves to be worshipped as gods. But they were of the same character as earth humans, good or evil, and thus beings who were friendly or unfriendly, helpful or exploitative, peaceful, aggressive, open, devious, and even warlike. All these deities, as Sfath, my father, writes in his annals, were of various shapes and sizes, but human beings who...
Contact Report 836.
Let me say something about this. We Plejaren have maintained neutrality in our Federation for more than 52,000 years, with the whole Federation, in Earth terms, encompassing worlds in solar systems many light years across. Our neutrality ensures absolute peace and freedom throughout the Federation for all existing species of human beings, who are of various types and accordingly have a different appearance from that known to Earth's human beings. They are all, however, human beings who have their own forms of personality, consciousness and mind, peculiarity and individuality, habit, nature, attitude, nature, and specificity, peculiarity and characteristic, and so on. But with regard to neutrality, I have something to say, namely what we Plejaren understand by it, and that for more than 52,000 years, when our ancestors introduced it, Caratralian, as we call it, we have really had peace and freedom throughout our vast federation, which was not the case before with our very early ancestors for millions of years. When they first found passage into the cosmos of your universe dimension some 25 million years ago, our ancestors were still warlike. Now, neutrality, as we understand it, means that the human being never takes a stand for one side or the other in any form or manner, etc., never interferes. Never interferes, and thus never does or thinks anything that affects one or the other side, either in a good, that is to say right, or in a bad, that is to say wrong way. A real, true neutrality is of endless duration and thus perpetual and completely independent of any other state, alliance or organization, etc. If, however, an alliance is entered into in the form of a political manner and cooperation with another state, then it is absolutely without exception necessary that, in addition to exactly the same neutrality, the same legislation prevails in every respect, in every form, and has all-round unlimited validity. Namely, the legislation must be such that it may never include a life in its existence and never a death penalty of any kind in a punishment. Humanitarian aid, on the other hand, is of course also permitted under neutrality, as are neutral peace negotiations and equally, completely neutral observation and resulting reporting as information for the populations, from whom world events are never to be concealed.
Contact Report 852.
Yes, I know which sphere you mean, which is actually a huge and many millions of years old library sphere.
Correct. They were records from when the
natural dimensional gate was found, and the first of our very distant ancestors came through that into this Dern universe, and ultimately to this Earth. All the records of the library sphere, as you call it, showed us other dimensional gateways, near which some of our peoples settled on life-bearing planets. Furthermore, through the information records in the sphere, we became aware that at the time 267 million years ago, it was discovered that this creation corresponded to a twin creation, as well as that a way was found to enter the sister creation, the Dajansini Arg Lasergnuralin, that is to say, the second-born creation, the twin creation. Consequently, 2 of our distant ancestral peoples emigrated to the sister creation and settled there.
Aha, then they were the ancestors of the Sonair and Askit's people. As Svath told me, there had been contact between them and the Plejaren for millions of years, but Svath could not explain to me how this came about.
I suppose that is understandable, for everything fell into oblivion, and the knowledge of the origin only became known to us when you were able to open the orb, which was sealed to all and could not be opened.